Games have had a hard road to being seen as art, and you could very well argue that because the only way to get people interested in the world of The Last of Us was to make it a TV show, games are still not art, still so closely tethered to their roots as coin-op token takers that they have failed to catch the imagination of audiences outside their niche. Furthermore, we as artists and critics have had a hard time breaking apart the biases present in our society, asking why things are the way they are and looking into exactly what these trends and tropes we cling to so dearly are saying. Art does not exist in a vacuum, and conscious or not, there are beliefs and ideals that have crept their way into media without our realization, and we need to think critically about what these design decisions say. When I ask you to think critically about a game, many people would turn to something like, Cuphead has good levels, animations, and music, but the controls could be better and the bosses are difficult. This sort of pro-con point system they tally up in their head. If they're really pushing it, some folks would take the time to then analyze how those pieces fit together, how gameplay exemplifies story, or vice versa. But we're still not really at the kinds of critical thinking we employ in cinema or with museum pieces. This is the equivalent of boasting about the camera lens or the kinds of brushes an artist used, or if an actor's good or not. The kinds of critique that end with a thumbs up or down rather than a complete thought about the choices made in producing art. It's not an essay, it's just a grade. There is room for simply rating a piece and moving on, I assure you, but just as we leave reviews on Steam recommending games to others or lambasting the amount of water levels, it's just as valuable for us to discuss the symbolism used in media and the history surrounding them, even if their use is not intentional. Cuphead is a 2017 action platformer. I'm glad that we have that settled, okay? Cuphead is a 2017 action platformer about selling your soul and needing to extort a city into giving up theirs after they made deals to sell their own souls, inspired by the works of the Fleischer Brothers and the general vibe of Depression-era cartoons. The Moldenhauer set to work on the game in 2000 before abandoning it due to technical limitations and restarting in 2010. The game was always meant to have a faux retro art style, as interviews about the game's earliest days seem to indicate that it would have had an 8 or 16-bit inspired look, but they made the ultimate decision to ape the visual language and design of 1930s animation to help the game stand out. And through a lot of work, hiring up anyone they could with expertise in traditional lightbox animation, and one remortgaged house plus some funding from Microsoft, the game launched in 2017 to financial and critical acclaim. They loved the cartoons growing up, they wanted to share their love for the era, and they made the conscious decision to shy away from the more racially problematic eras of the medium at the time. Right? There are 4 human characters in Cuphead: Sally Stageplay, Mr. Stageplay, Dr. Call, and Captain Brainibeard. While the captain is a bit darker in complexion, the other 3 characters are unambiguously white, and you could debate the captain just has a tan if you wanted. He's no doubt Mediterranean, but if you wanted to say, sure, he's got a tan, then sure, he's got a tan, I guess. And sure enough, these characters have their roots in traditional animation of the era, the likes of Popeye's eclectic cast, or the human folks in early Warner Brothers works. The other characters, albeit non-human, carry some baggage of race and ethnicity, from Cagney Carnation's South American-inspired backing track to Jimmy just being a relatively clumsy mishmash of genie tropes, to Werner von Vermen's, Swiss? No, Italian name. Beyond that, we get some very basic character archetypes like a talking apple, a queen bee, a funny ghost or two, a pair of minstrel-inspired tricksters with gambling debt appeasing a very obvious Cab Calloway parody, Beppy the Clown. Okay. James Stewart Blackton was a vaudeville artist known for his lightning sketches, where he'd animate a drawing by sketching a picture bit by bit and moving elements around in front of a camera that would create several exposures, creating an animated time-lapse while also delighting his audience. Sketches included cracking open a bottle of champagne, as well as turning racial slurs into caricatures of the people those slurs are about. Vaudeville was an evolution of the minstrel show, an entertainment act that usually employed racial caricatures for comedic effect, and many early animators got their start in vaudeville, and the racist overcurrents of their old work crept into the cartoons they'd make. Layabouts, thieves, gamblers, jazz musicians were abundant in the early days, inspired by the implied sin and debauchery of black culture of the era. You could have a cartoon about, let's say, a pair of lazy slackers who go to a casino and bet their souls on a game of craps, trading the paradise of heaven for the sinful pair o' dice, and nobody would think twice. The message was received. Now wait just a second. Cab Calloway was a big band musician best known for his work in the 1930s cartoon Minnie the Moocher or the 1980 film Blues Brothers. Cab had a long career, and nobody could move or sing quite like him. And that reflected in the cartoons he was in back in his heyday. Sure, in shorts like Clean Pastures, he's depicted as a blatantly racist caricature not unlike that of the minstrel days of old. But if he isn't depicted like that, especially in the later cartoons when racist caricatures were actually realized to be shitty, he becomes a ghost, a clown, a magical walrus. He's not a black guy anymore, he's just some weird creature, just some wacky character. And that brings us to King Dice, the very Cab Calloway-inspired head of the Devil's Casino, complete with a wicked baritone provided by black musician Alana Bridgewater in the game, or black comedian Wayne Brady in the TV series, respectively. The fluid and stretchy movement of Cab's cartoons with Flesher in the 1930s and the jazzy backing track and iconography of the Sinner's Den from the cartoons of yore are all here. While the Moldenhauers knew of the racist ghosts that haunt the cartoons of their childhood, their surface-level interpretation of their wretched past means that King Dice and Cuphead as a whole bear the racial biases of an entire generation of cartoons out in the open, making their black representation buried beneath the veneer of a six-sided die no better than the cartoons 90 years preceding Cuphead's release. But that's not to invalidate the work done on Cuphead. The game plays great, it's got a killer soundtrack, every single moment is inventive and creative, and the DLC, at least in my opinion, seems to have taken the criticism of black voices following Cuphead's release to heart, to introduce a more diverse and eclectic set of characters that downplay the unfortunate implications of the Drinking Vessel brothers and their quest for redemption, and kind of just celebrate the animation of the era. It's clear the Moldenhauers realized that their surface-level observations and course corrections from the years leading up to the launch were learned from, and more work was done to celebrate the era while also acknowledging the problems in its design, and actively avoiding to recreate them. This brings us back to Pizza Tower. Mr. Pinch is a stage hazard in the sewer level Oh Shit, a man made of cheese who sits in a pipe and snatches change out of Mr. Spaghetti's pockets, launching him back into the air like a slingshot. The hooked nose, the miserly expression, and the malicious grin sure do seem like an anti-Semitic caricature, no? Well, joke's on you, the character is in part based on Ebenezer Scrooge. As if Ebenezer's not an Israeli name and the character's design in the first editions of Christmas Carol were not just an anti-Semitic caricature. But Mr. Pinch is also based on Mr. Burns from The Simpsons. He's also got a hooked nose, he's also a miserly character, and I was ready to assume he was inspired by Scrooge. But he's not. Mr. Burns' greed is inspired by the likes of Howard Hughes and the Rockefeller family. Some of his mannerisms are inspired by Ronald Reagan, his thin limbs and frail physique inspired by that of a praying mantis, and his face is based on Barry Diller, the Jewish founder of the Fox network. Uh-oh. Mr. Burns, whether intentional or not, is also an anti-Semitic caricature, though it's through the virtue of lampooning the hand that fed The Simpsons and exaggerating his facial features for the sake of comedy, which is how a caricature works. And in this case, a racial one at that. This gets even more complicated when you consider that Mr. Burns is also a modernization of sorts of Pantalone, a commedia dell'arte character known for being very old and greedy, moving with great difficulty due to his age, which matches Montgomery Burns' appearance and character. But he's also known for his pointed nose, long chin, and hunched goblin-esque gait. But as for if the commedia dell'arte is based on racial caricature being the product of 1500s Rome, I mean, that'd be ridiculous, right? The idea that the racial tropes levied at those of Jewish descent are nearly half a millennia old, as if people would hang on to... They are. They absolutely are. We are constantly surrounded by the specters of racist caricature, and for a lot of people, it's just something you don't even see. Cuphead's just a game about kids screwing up and fixing their mistake. Mr. Burns is just a cartoonishly evil billionaire. Hogwarts house elves and goblin bankers are just silly little fantasy things. The Goblin Uprising attempt in 1612 at Hogwarts? Probably nothing. You're probably just overthinking it. What's the proper recourse? In most of these cases, this isn't the work of outright malice. But if it is, yikes. They could have been so much more overt and so much more disrespectful in their own way if that was the case. In the original 2014 trailer for Cuphead, the devil had very big, thick lips, and those were downplayed after that trailer. He looked like an unfortunate caricature of a black man, and then they redesigned him to look a little more Grinch-esque. The Simpsons has played its ethnic characters for drama just as much as it's used them for comedy, even retiring some characters over the years as it became clear that just pointing at their ethnicity isn't funny. The Moldenhauers didn't mean intentional harm in making Cuphead, just enough thought wasn't put into the world of their game and they tried to make amends after the fact. McPig hails from 4chan, where his characters appeared in occasional comic strips, and while the early days of Pizza Tower's development had its own very hefty handful of edgy humor, just a pair of caricatures and a call for police brutality to be enacted on the player at a certain completion percentage make it into the final game. The latter originally meant for causing significant harm to befall Peppino and... I mean, we could talk about tribal cheese and the oregano desert level, but it's so overt that I don't think it's worth analyzing. You know what this is. They're even called a tribal. Kinda gross. We have built up a catalog of character tropes over the history of Western media, dating back centuries and continuing to this day. A canon of characterization and visual language that tells us what we need to know about the people we come across in cinema, in theater, in games, and on TV. And we've added to it and taken from it for so long that so many worrisome trends have appeared and been reinforced. And it's in our best interest as media consumers and media producers to look at these tropes we use and question their existence. We live in an age where looking up the history of these symbols and icons is as easy as taking our phone and looking it up. And we have the ability to have the awareness to break and bend these stereotypes we've lived with for so long. We should be able to come together and explore the ramifications of the art we create and consume, because only good can come from it. Do we need the brutish tribal native character anymore? Should we need a hooked nose to tell us a character is of malicious intent? Do these character designs do more harm than good in a needless manner? Can we do better? I'd like to imagine we can, and carrying the history of these tropes and how they've been used to demean and ostracize means we can learn from it. And we should learn from it. It is at this point that I must say I'm eternally grateful for Yusef Cole's article, Cuphead and the Racist Spectre of Flesher Animation, as well as the Tutzani Theater Company's Something from Another Time Is Not an Excuse. I've linked both below, and I highly recommend giving them a read. I must also express gratitude towards Studio MDHR and Tour de Pizza for their work on Cuphead and Pizza Tower respectively. And I hope that only positive change, or at the very least, a willingness to do better, can come from critique. We owe it to ourselves to think critically about the media we consume, and sometimes implicit messages arise not out of malice, perhaps just ignorance, and exploring the history can help us make more inclusive art in the future. If you liked this video and you'd like to see more, I'd recommend subscribing. Coffee and social media links are in the description.